In the spring of 1918, World War I was roaring into its final, most brutal phase. Germany, getting really desperate for a win before American troops could tip the scales, unleashed a series of absolutely massive attacks on the Western Front. Today, we're going to break down one of the biggest of those gambles, the Battle of the Lys. And this right here is the question at the very heart of it all. The Battle of the Lys wasn't just some other skirmish. This was a moment where the outcome of the entire war was just hanging by a thread. This was Germany's all-or-nothing shot to try and knock the British out of the war for good. All right, let's get into it. This battle was part of a much bigger German plan, which you might know as the Spring Offensive. And this specific attack in the Flanders region got the code name Operation Georgette. And its goal? Well, it was nothing less than a knockout punch. So what was Operation Georgette really? The plan was pretty simple and devastatingly ambitious. They wanted to just shatter the Allied line, sweep out to the English Channel, and grab the ports of Calais, Dunkirk, and Boulogne. If they could do that, they'd sever the main supply line for the entire British Expeditionary Force. It would have effectively strangled them, forcing Britain to sue for peace. Game over. Now here's something that's really telling. This offensive, this Georgette, wasn't even the one Germany wanted to launch. The original plan was way bigger, codenamed George. But after years of this grinding, brutal war, the German army was stretched incredibly thin. They just didn't have the men or the resources for George. So they had to settle for the smaller, less ambitious Georgette. And that right there tells you just how desperate they were getting. So how were they going to succeed, even with a smaller plan? Well, they played their cards really smart, leveraging three key advantages. First, they used their elite stormtroopers, the Stoßtruppen, who were absolute experts at infiltrating enemy lines and causing chaos. Second, they picked their spot carefully, a sector that was considered quiet where the Allies sent tired divisions to rest. And third, and this was crucial, the very tip of their spear was aimed right at two Portuguese divisions that were exhausted, under strength, and literally waiting to be replaced. For the Germans, the timing was perfect. For the Allies, it was a disaster waiting to happen. And with all that in their favor, the German assault kicked off on April 9th. And boy, did it work. The initial success was just unbelievably swift and devastating. I mean, just look at the speed of this collapse. It's terrifying. On day 1, April 9th, the attack hits, and that Portuguese line is just shattered. It basically evaporates. Day 2, a whole other German army attacks further north, which makes the hole in the line even wider. In just 48 hours, the front hadn't just bent, it had broken wide open. And just how big of a deal was this initial push? This one number says it all: 15 kilometers. You have to remember, in a war where you fought and died for every single meter of ground, a 15-kilometer advance was almost unheard of. It was a catastrophic breakthrough. The Germans were just pouring into the gap, and it looked like nothing could stop them. This brings us to a moment of just pure, raw desperation for the Allied command. This breakthrough was so bad that it threatened to completely unravel the entire British army in Flanders, which leads us to this iconic phrase, backs to the wall. Try to imagine this scene for a second. It's absolute chaos. Communication lines are cut, whole units are being overrun, and the Germans are getting closer and closer to the vital supply hub of Hazebrouck. If Hazebrouck fell, the road to the Channel ports was wide open. The situation was as dire as it gets. And this is when the British commander, Field Marshal Douglas Haig, issues one of the most famous orders of the entire war. This wasn't some complex strategic plan, it was a desperate emotional plea. He was basically telling his men, that's it, there's nowhere else to retreat. We either stand and fight here, or we lose the war. And yet, they didn't break. The line held, just barely. So how on earth did the Allies pull themselves back from the brink of total collapse and stop this offensive dead in its tracks? Well, the Allied response really boiled down to three crucial moves. First, they threw in their absolute best reserves, like the incredibly tough Australian divisions, to plug the most critical gaps. Think of them as firefighters rushing to the worst part of the blaze. Second, the new Allied Supreme Commander, Ferdinand Foch, made the call to send in French divisions to help shore up the line. And third, the British made the gut-wrenching decision to give up all the ground they had bled so much for the year before at Passchendaele. It was painful, but it allowed them to shorten their lines and create a much stronger defensive front. And that was the turning point. The fighting was still incredibly brutal, and the Germans did manage to capture some important high ground like Kemmelberg. But that unstoppable momentum they had at the beginning, it was gone.
The German advance had bogged down into a slow, bloody grind. It wasn't a war-winning breakthrough anymore. So, when the dust finally settled and the offensive was called off on April 29th, what was the final result? This leads us to the big question. Was this what you'd call a Pyrrhic victory for Germany? You know, a victory that costs you so much it's basically a defeat?
Let's look at the final scorecard. On one hand, Germany gained a huge chunk of territory, a big bulge in the line, 15 kilometers deep. But strategically, it was a total failure. They didn't take Hazebrouck, they didn't get anywhere near the Channel ports. They had absolutely battered the British army, but they hadn't broken it. But that territory came at a horrifying price. Now, what's really interesting here is how much the casualty estimates vary between historians. That alone tells you how chaotic and confused the fighting was. But whichever set of numbers you trust, the human cost was just staggering on all sides. We're talking hundreds of thousands of men in just about 3 weeks.
And here's the most critical point. It's not just about the number of casualties for Germany, it's about who they lost. They had thrown their very best, their elite stormtroopers into this fight, and those units were gutted. These were men they simply could not replace. This one battle bled the German army of its best offensive weapon.
And that leaves us with this final, massive question. Operation Georgette won Germany a lot of ground and inflicted terrible casualties, but by failing to land that knockout punch and by sacrificing its most valuable troops in the process, it may very well have been the blow from which the German army could never truly recover, paving the way for the Allied victories that would end the war just a few months later.